He hired a frontier cook, but when she arrived with a baby, his lonely ranch was never the same. The woman stepped down from the stage wagon with snow in her hair, dust on her hem, and a baby tucked against her side like the last warm thing left in the world. Wade Harlan stood on the porch of Pine Hollow Ranch and stared at her as if the Wyoming wind had brought him the wrong life. He had sent a letter to Cheyenne for a cook. A quiet woman if possible. Strong hands. No trouble. No family. That was what he had written in plain black ink. He needed someone to feed 6 ranch hands through winter, not someone to bring soft crying and small blankets into a house that had been silent for years. The wagon driver, old Amos Reed, pulled his collar up against the cold and cleared his throat. "Here she is, Wade, Mrs. Maggie Whitaker." The young woman looked no older than 23. Her dark brown dress had been brushed clean as best as she could manage, but the long road had left its mark. Dust clung to her boots. A loose strand of brown hair stuck to her cheek. Her eyes were tired, but they did not drop from Wade's face. On her hip, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, a baby boy slept with one fist pressed against his mouth. Wade's jaw tightened. "That child yours?" he asked. The question came out colder than he meant it to, but once it was spoken, he did not soften it. Maggie shifted the baby a little higher on her hip. The movement was gentle, practiced, protective. "Yes, sir." "You failed to mention him." The wind pushed across the yard, rattling the loose boards on the barn wall. One of the horses stamped near the hitching rail. Behind Wade, the ranch house stood wide and brown beneath a hard white sky, its windows dark, its chimney breathing smoke. Maggie swallowed, but her chin stayed lifted. "I answered your advertisement honest, Mr. Harlan. I can cook. I can clean. I can bake bread, cure meat, stretch flour, keep coffee hot, and feed working men before sunrise." "That is not what I asked." Her hand tightened on the baby's blanket. "No," she said quietly, "it is not." Wade looked past her at the wagon. One carpet bag, one small bundle tied with rope, nothing else. Not enough belongings for a woman starting over, just enough for a woman running out of choices. He hated that he noticed. He hated more that it stirred something in him. Amos climbed down from the wagon seat, rubbing his gloved hands together. "Sky's turning mean, Wade. Road back to Mercy Ridge won't be fit by dark." Wade did not look at him. "My arrangement was for one cook." Maggie's face went still. For a breath, only the wind answered. Then the baby stirred. His little mouth opened, his brow wrinkled, and a thin, sleepy sound slipped from him. Maggie turned her body away from the cold and pressed her cheek near his head, whispering something Wade could not hear. The sound struck Wade in the chest, so hard he nearly stepped back. It was not loud, not even a true cry, just a small child waking in a strange place. But inside Wade Harlan's house, no child had made a sound for 7 winters. His eyes moved to the upstairs window above the porch. The curtains there had not been opened in years. Maggie followed his glance but said nothing. Wade forced his face back into stone. "There are rough men on this ranch," he said. "Long hours, cold mornings, no place for a baby." "I know what rough places look like, sir." There was no bitterness in her voice, only truth. That made it harder to dismiss. He looked at her hands. One held the child. The other gripped the handle of her carpet bag. Her knuckles were red from cold. A small rip showed near the cuff of her sleeve, mended twice already. Still, she did not ask for pity. That bothered him too. "Amos can take you back in the morning," Wade said. Maggie blinked once. The words had hit her, though she tried to hide it. "I understand." She bent to gather her bundle, careful not to wake the baby fully. For one painful second, Wade saw how little she had. A bag, A blanket, a child, and a back straightened by pride because pride was all she could afford. Amos looked between them. "Wade," he said low, "storm's coming hard. You ain't sending her off tonight." "I said morning." The old driver scratched his beard and muttered, "Morning may not come gentle." Wade turned toward the ridge. Dark clouds were pushing down from the north, heavy and low. The peaks beyond Pine Hollow were already fading behind a curtain of white. Snow dust blew across the yard in little twisting lines. He knew that sky. Every rancher in Wyoming knew it. By midnight, the road to Mercy Ridge would be buried. He breathed out through his nose. "One night," he said. Maggie looked up. The baby opened his eyes then, dark and round beneath the edge of the blue blanket. For a strange moment, he stared straight at Wade, not afraid, not smiling, just looking with the calm wonder of a child who did not know he had arrived unwanted. Wade felt the old ache move under his ribs. He turned away before it showed. "There is a small room off the kitchen," he said. "You can sleep there. Supper's already handled. You won't need to work." Maggie gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Harlan." "It is not a welcome," he said. Her eyes lowered for the first time, but only for a moment. "I know." Those two words stayed with him longer than they should have. Inside, the ranch house smelled of wood smoke, leather, old coffee, and emptiness. Maggie stepped through the door slowly as if she were entering a church after everyone had gone home. The main room was large, plain, and clean in the way a lonely man kept things clean. Nothing soft, nothing extra, a long table, a black stove, a few chairs, a gun rack on the wall though the rifles looked untouched. A framed photograph turned face down on a shelf. Maggie noticed it. Wade noticed her noticing it. "Kitchen S through there," he said sharply. She moved where he pointed. The kitchen had good bones but little warmth. Flour sack half empty, beans in a barrel, salt pork hanging from a hook, a pot of coffee burned black on the stove. The room had been used but not loved. Maggie set her carpet bag beside the wall and laid the baby gently in a wooden crate near the stove, patting it with her shawl. The boy blinked up at the ceiling beams and waved one small hand. Wade stood in the doorway. "You need anything, ask Mrs. Bell in town when you leave." Maggie turned toward the stove. "Your men will be coming in soon. That does not concern you tonight." She looked at the burned coffee, the hard biscuits wrapped in a cloth, and the pot of beans that had stuck to the bottom. "Mr. Harlan," she said softly, "I know you mean to send me away, but would you allow me to leave one good supper behind?" He stared at her. Outside, the wind struck the house hard enough to shake the window glass. Before Wade could answer, the baby in the crate gave a sudden laugh. It was small and bright, no bigger than a spark from the stove. Maggie froze. Wade froze too. That laugh filled the kitchen like something forbidden had found its way home. For a moment, Wade's hard face changed. Only a little. Only enough for Maggie to see the grief behind it. Then he looked away and said, rough as gravel, "Do what you want." Maggie rolled up her sleeves. By dusk, the first snow had begun to fall thick across Pine Hollow Ranch. And by the time Wade's ranch hands came stomping in from the cold, hungry and cursing under their breath, the lonely house smelled of fresh biscuits, fried potatoes, hot gravy, and something Wade Harlan had not smelled in years. Home. But when Maggie reached for the flour sack, a folded paper slipped from her carpet bag and fell beneath the table. Wade saw the seal before she did, and the name written across it made his blood turn cold. The folded paper lay beneath the table leg, half in shadow, half in firelight. Wade Harlan saw only three things before Maggie bent quickly to snatch it up. A dark red seal. A courthouse stamp. and the name *** Mercy Ridge County Office written across the front. His stomach tightened. Maggie pushed the paper deep inside her carpet bag and tied the flap shut with hands that moved too fast to be calm. When she turned back to the stove, her face was steady again, but Wade had already seen the fear. Not shame. Not guilt. Fear. He said nothing. The ranch hands came in before he could decide whether to ask. The front door opened hard, and cold air rushed through the house with the smell of wet wool, horse sweat, and snow. Silas Boone, Wade's gray-bearded foreman, entered first, knocking his boots against the threshold. Behind him came the others, tired men with red faces and empty stomachs. Then every man stopped. The kitchen was warm. The table was set. A pan of biscuits sat near the stove, golden and high. Fried potatoes steamed in a cast-iron skillet. Thick gravy bubbled low. Coffee, fresh and strong, filled the room with a smell that made even the hardest men go quiet. Silas looked at Wade. Then he looked at Maggie. Then his eyes dropped to the wooden crate beside the stove, where baby Eli lay wrapped in the blue blanket, staring up at the moving shadows on the ceiling. "Well now," Silas said slowly, "that is a sight I did not expect before supper." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron. She had no proper apron yet, so she had tied a folded towel around her waist. "Evening," she said, "food is ready." One of the younger hands, a freckled boy named Henry Pike, leaned toward the crate. "Boss," Henry whispered, as if the baby were a sleeping judge, "there's a child in the kitchen." "I can see that," Wade said. Maggie kept her eyes on the plates. "No one needs to mind him. He is quiet when he is warm." Eli chose that moment to kick his foot free of the blanket. Henry's face, softened like butter left near the stove. "Small little fellow, ain't he?" "Sit down and eat," Wade ordered. The men obeyed, but their eyes kept drifting toward the baby. They tried not to stare at Maggie either, though most of them failed. A woman in Pine Hollow Ranch had been rare enough. A woman with a baby was something none of them knew how to handle. Maggie served them without fuss. She did not smile too much. She did not act like a guest. She moved with quiet speed, setting down plates, refilling coffee, shifting the skillet before the potatoes burned. She remembered who had already been served and who had not. When Silas asked for more gravy, she passed it before he finished the sentence. For several minutes, the only sound was eating. That told Wade more than words would have. His men usually talked through supper. They laughed, complained, argued about horses, weather, cattle prices, and card games. Tonight they bent over their plates like they had found gold in the bottom of a creek. Silas broke the silence first. "Ma'am," he said, holding up half a biscuit, "this here could make a man forgive winter." A few hands chuckled. Maggie gave a small smile, but it passed quickly. "Thank you." Wade watched from the head of the table. He had not touched his plate yet. She could cook. There was no denying it. The biscuits were soft, the potatoes crisp, the gravy rich but not heavy. She had made a supper out of plain stores and tired provisions, and somehow the whole house felt less hollow because of it. That made him uneasy. He did not want the house changed. A changed house remembered things. Eli fussed just as Maggie sat down with her own plate. The baby's face wrinkled, and his small mouth opened. Before the cry could rise, Maggie was up again, lifting him with one arm while reaching for the coffee pot with the other. "Sit," Silas said gruffly. Maggie looked surprised. The old foreman cleared his throat and stood, awkward as a fence post. "I mean you eat. I can pour coffee." A few men stared at him, as if he had taken leave of his senses. Silas glared back. "What? I still remember how." Maggie hesitated, then slowly sat down, holding Eli close while taking a bite of her supper with her free hand. Wade saw how hungry she was. She tried to hide it, eating small and careful, but her body betrayed her. She had been running on pride and little else. The realization settled heavily in him. After supper, the men carried their plates to the wash basin without being asked. That had never happened before. Henry even tried to stack the cups and nearly dropped 3 of them. Maggie washed dishes while Eli slept again. The men drifted out one by one toward the bunkhouse, quieter than usual. Silas lingered near the door. "She stays the night?" he asked Wade. "One night." Silas looked at the snow pressing against the dark window. "Road will close." "I know what roads do in snow." The foreman studied him for a moment, then lowered his voice. "House didn't sound empty tonight." Wade's eyes hardened. "That is enough." Silas nodded once, but there was sadness in his face. "I reckon it is." When he left, the room grew still. Maggie dried the last plate and placed it in the cupboard. The baby slept in the crate, one tiny hand curled over the edge of the blanket. Wade stood near the stove, arms crossed, trying not to look at either of them. But his eyes kept going back to the carpet bag. Maggie noticed. "You saw the paper," she said. Wade did not answer at first. "Should I have?" he asked. "No. That makes a man wonder." "I know." The same 2 words from earlier, quiet, careful, heavy. Wade stepped closer, but not enough to frighten her. "Is there trouble following you, Mrs. Whitaker?" Her face changed. Not much, only the smallest tightening near her mouth. "No trouble that belongs to you." That is not an answer. It is the only one I can give tonight. Wade looked at the baby. "If that paper means the law is looking for you, I need to know." Her eyes flashed then, not with anger alone but with hurt. "I have broken no law." "Then why hide it?" "Because some papers tell the truth," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "And some papers only help powerful men bury it." The words hung in the kitchen. Wade felt the cold from outside pressing through the walls. He had known men like that, men who used stamps and signatures like loaded weapons, men who smiled in church and stole land by Monday morning. Mercy Ridge had its share. Before he could speak, Eli woke with a soft cry. Maggie turned away at once, lifting him from the crate. She pressed him against her shoulder and swayed gently. The baby quieted, but not before his little hand caught at Wade's sleeve. Wade froze. Eli's fingers were warm through the fabric, small, trusting, holding on without knowing whom he held. Maggie saw it and whispered, "Eli, no." But Wade did not pull away. For one long moment, he stood there with a child's hand gripping his sleeve, and a woman's frightened secret lying between them like a locked door. Then a sharp sound broke through the house. A horse screamed outside. Wade turned toward the window. Another cry followed, high and panicked from the barn. Maggie clutched Eli tighter. Wade grabbed his coat from the peg. "Stay here," he said. But when he opened the door, snow blew into the kitchen, and in that white storm, Maggie saw a lantern swinging near the far fence. Someone was out there. Someone who did not belong to Pine Hollow Ranch. The storm swallowed Wade Harlan before Maggie could ask another question. The kitchen door slammed behind him, and the whole house shook under the force of the wind. Snow flew against the window in wild white sheets, covering the glass so thickly that Maggie could barely see the yard. But she had seen enough. A lantern near the far fence. A horse crying in fear. And a moving shape where no ranch hand should have been. Maggie held Eli tight against her chest. The baby was quiet now, but his little body had gone stiff, as if even he understood the house had changed. The warm smell of supper still hung in the kitchen, but it no longer felt like comfort. It felt like something fragile that could be broken with one hard knock. She hurried to the window and wiped frost from the pane with her sleeve. Outside, the world was a blur. Wade's dark shape crossed the yard toward the barn, bent against the storm. Another lantern moved near him now. Sela's must have come from the bunkhouse. The horse cried again, then a man shouted, but the wind tore the words apart. Maggie's eyes searched the snow. The lantern by the far fence disappeared. Her heart dropped. She turned toward her carpet bag. The courthouse paper was inside, tucked beneath Eli's spare blanket. It felt heavier than iron now. She had carried it across 2 territories and 3 railroad lines, always telling herself that once she reached Pine Hollow she could breathe. A remote ranch needed a cook. A lonely man needed no questions answered. Work would hide her. Winter would bury the trail. But a courthouse seal had followed her into the kitchen. And now someone stood outside in the storm. Eli made a soft sound, his mouth brushing against her collar. "Hush, little one," Maggie whispered. "Mama has you." Her voice sounded braver than she felt. A few minutes later, the door burst open again. Wade came in first, snow crusted across his shoulders and hat. Sela's followed, carrying a lantern. Behind them, Henry Pike and Miguel dragged in a saddle blanket wet with snow. No stranger came with them. "What happened?" Maggie asked. Wade pulled off his gloves, his face hard. "One of the mares got loose and tangled herself near the lower fence." "In this weather?" "Gate latch was open," Sela said. Wade shot him a look, but the old foreman did not take the words back. Maggie went still. Wade hung his coat near the stove, though his eyes stayed on the window. "Could have been wind," he said. Sela's mouth tightened. Wind does not lift an iron latch from the outside. Henry looked from one man to the other. "You think somebody opened it?" Nobody answered. That silence did more than any answer could have done. Maggie felt Wade's gaze turn toward her. Not accusing this time. Questioning. She looked down at Eli and stroked the back of his head. "I told you," she said softly, "the trouble does not belong to you." Wade stepped closer. "It crossed my fence tonight." Sela's and the others grew quiet. The old foreman took Henry by the shoulder and nodded toward the door. "Come on, let the boss talk." The men left reluctantly, their boots scraping the floor. Miguel paused near the crate where Eli had slept, then looked at Maggie with kind, worried eyes before following the rest out. When the door closed, Maggie and Wade were alone again. The storm pressed against the walls. The stove popped. Eli's breathing warmed the hollow of Maggie's neck. Wade stood by the table, the lantern throwing deep shadows across his face. "Who would follow you here?" he asked. Maggie closed her eyes for a breath. A part of her wanted to tell him everything. The name, the threat, the reason she had run from a boarding house before dawn with Eli wrapped beneath her coat, the man who had smiled in public and whispered ugly promises where no one else could hear. But trust was not something a desperate woman could spend too quickly. Not when her baby's future hung on every word. "My husband died before Eli was born," she said. Wade's face did not change, but his eyes lowered to the child. "He worked for the Union Pacific Survey Office," she continued. "Not a rich man, not an important one, but he was honest." "What was his name?" "Daniel Whitaker." The name made her throat tighten, but she held steady. "He found something wrong in a land record, a claim that had been changed after a widow signed it, then another, small ranches, lonely people, folks who could not afford lawyers or long rides to court." Wade's eyes narrowed. "In Mercy Ridge County." Maggie nodded. "He wrote down what he found, copies, dates, names. Before he could take it to the territorial judge, he was killed in a rockslide on the survey road." The kitchen seemed to grow colder. Wade was silent for a long moment. "You think it was not an accident?" "I do not know what I think," Maggie said. "I only know that 2 days after Daniel was buried, a county clerk came to my rented room and told me my husband had been mistaken. He wanted his papers. When I said I did not have them, he told me a woman alone with a baby should be careful where she made enemies." Wade's jaw flexed. "What clerk?" Maggie hesitated. "Elias Crow." The name landed hard. Wade turned away and stared into the stove fire. "You know him," Maggie said. "Everybody near Mercy Ridge knows Crow. He smiles like a preacher and counts like a thief." "He is more than a thief." Wade looked back at her. Maggie stepped to the carpet bag, untied it, and pulled out the folded courthouse paper. Her hands shook now, and she hated that they did. She placed it on the table between them but kept one palm over it. "I was not running from the law," she said. "I was running toward the one place Daniel marked before he died." Wade looked at the paper. Then at her. "What place?" Maggie lifted her hand. Wade unfolded the document slowly. It was not a warrant. Not a summons. It was a copied land transfer, stamped months earlier, bearing several names in dark ink. Wade read the first lines with a frown. Then he stopped. His face lost color. Maggie saw the change and felt her breath catch. "What is it?" she asked. Wade did not answer. His hand tightened around the paper until it wrinkled. At the bottom, beneath Elias Crow's clerk mark, was another name tied to a claim transfer. Harlan. Wade Harlan. Maggie took one step toward him. "Mr. Harlan." His eyes rose to hers, and the grief in them had turned sharp. "This says I signed away the east pasture of Pine Hollow." "Did you?" "No." The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of thunder. A hard gust struck the house. Somewhere upstairs, a loose shutter banged once against the wall. Wade looked toward the dark ceiling. For the first time since Maggie had arrived, he did not look like a man angry at her secret. He looked like a man realizing the same hand that had hunted her had already reached into his home. Maggie drew Eli closer. "If this moment touched your heart, stay with the story, because the truth at Pine Hollow has only begun to open." Wade folded the paper with careful hands, but his voice came rough. "You said your husband marked this ranch before he died." "Yes." "Why?" Maggie looked toward her bag again. "Because Daniel believed the first stolen claim in Mercy Ridge was not a stranger's land." Wade stared at her. Maggie's voice dropped to almost nothing. "He believed it began with your father." Wade Harlan did not speak for so long that Maggie began to hear every small sound in the kitchen. The stove ticking as the iron cooled. Eli's soft breath against her shoulder. Snow scratching at the window like dry fingers. The folded paper sat between them on the table, but it felt larger than the room. It had brought Daniel's warning into Pine Hollow. It had tied Maggie's fear to Wade's land. And now it had opened a door Wade had kept shut inside himself for years. "My father," Wade said at last. His voice was low, flat, and dangerous in its quietness. Maggie wished she could take the words back, but truth did not become kinder by hiding. "That is what Daniel wrote," she said. "He believed your father's final land record had been altered after his death." Wade looked at her then, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw something worse than anger in him. She saw a son being asked to doubt the ground beneath his own childhood. "My father was no fool," he said. "I did not say he was." He kept records in 3 different places. He counted every calf twice. He could read a man's lie before the man finished his sentence. Maggie nodded softly. Then maybe that is why someone waited until he was gone. The words hit their mark. Wade's hand closed on the back of a chair. The old wood gave a faint creak beneath his grip. Outside, a horse shifted in the barn, and the sound seemed to pull him back from the edge of himself. He turned from the table and walked to the kitchen door. "Get some sleep," he said. Maggie stared at his back. "Mr. Harlan." "I said sleep." He left before she could answer. The door closed hard, not in rage, but in pain held too tightly. Maggie stood alone in the kitchen, Eli heavy and warm in her arms, and felt the strange ache of having brought hurt to the only man who had not yet cast her out. She wanted to believe she had done the right thing. Daniel had trusted her with those papers. He had placed Eli's future in her hands before he ever knew he would not live to see his son. But as she looked around Wade's quiet kitchen, at the chair he had not sat in, at the coffee he had not finished, she wondered how many lives one truth could wound before it finally healed anything. She carried Eli into the small room off the kitchen. The room was plain, barely larger than a storage pantry, with one narrow bed, a washstand, and a peg for her dress. Yet after the road, the station benches, the cheap rooms with thin walls, it felt almost safe. Almost. She laid Eli down in the crate beside the bed and tucked the blue blanket around him. He blinked up at her, sleepy and trusting. "You have your father's eyes," she whispered. The baby made a small sound and curled his fist. Maggie sat on the edge of the bed and pressed Daniel's folded notes beneath the mattress. She did not sleep. Not truly. Every time the wind struck the house, she thought of the lantern by the fence. Every time a board creaked, she imagined Elia's crow stepping through the door with his clean coat, polite smile, and empty eyes. Near dawn, the storm weakened. The world outside turned gray. Maggie rose before the rest of the house. She washed her face in cold water, pinned her hair, and started the kitchen fire. Work gave her hands something to do when her heart would not settle. She had coffee boiling and biscuit dough under a cloth when Silas Boone came in from outside, snow on his hat and worry in his beard. "Mornin', ma'am." "Morning, Mr. Boone." "Silas is fine." He glanced toward her small room, where Eli had begun to stir. "Little man sleep all right." "As well as a baby can." Silas nodded, then lowered his voice. "Boss out in the old tack shed." Maggie looked up. "I thought he went to the barn." "No," Silas rubbed his jaw. "He went where he goes when old ghosts start making noise." Maggie did not ask what he meant, but Silas must have seen the question in her face. "There is a room upstairs," he said, "used to belong to his little sister Anna. After she passed, Wade shut it tight. After his folks followed her, he locked near everything soft in this house. Toys, quilts, his mother's dishes. Could not bear to look at them. Could not bear to throw them away either." Maggie's fingers went still in the flour. "Was Anna a baby?" 4 years old. Silas's voice gentled. Had yellow hair and a laugh loud enough to scare crows from the corn. Wade was 16 when fever took her. He carried her doll in his coat pocket through the whole burial service. Would have fought any man who mentioned it. Maggie looked toward the ceiling. The upstairs window. The closed curtain. The place Wade's eyes had gone when Eli first made a sound. Now she understood. Not fully. No one could fully understand another person's grief, but she understood enough to feel her own heart soften. "I did not know," she said. "Most don't," Wade made sure of that. Silas reached for the coffee, then paused. "That baby of yours," he opened something. "Boss does not like open things, makes him feel the weather." Before Maggie could answer, boots sounded on the porch. Wade entered, carrying cold with him. His eyes were shadowed, his hair damp from snow, and in one hand he held a small tin box. Maggie recognized the kind at once. Old, flat, used for letters or keepsakes. Selah straightened. Wade looked at him. Check the east pasture fence when the weather clears. Selah nodded and left without another word. Wade set the tin box on the table. Maggie wiped flour from her hands. I am sorry, she said. He looked at her. For what? For speaking of your father before I knew what it would cost you. Wade's face did not soften, but his voice lost some of its edge. Truth costs whether spoken early or late. He opened the tin box. Inside were papers tied with brown string, an old leather measuring book, and a small wooden horse carved with clumsy but loving hands. Its paint had faded to almost nothing. Maggie looked away from the toy, giving him privacy. Wade noticed. My father kept copies, he said, like you said. He untied the string and unfolded a brittle document. This is the original claim map for Pine Hollow. My mother made him keep it in her sewing chest because she said a man who trusted courthouse drawers too much deserved to lose his boots. Despite herself, Maggie smiled faintly. Wade did not smile, but something passed through his eyes, old and warm and painful. Then he laid Daniel's copied transfer beside his father's map. The room seemed to hold its breath. The east pasture line did not match. On Wade's father's map, the pasture ran all the way to the creek bend, where winter grass stayed thick and sweet beneath the snow. On the county copy, that same pasture had been shifted east, cut thin like a slice from a loaf. Enough land to match her. Enough water to control the herd in hard winter. Wade's face turned grim. Crow has been waiting, he said. For what? For me to need that pasture bad enough to sign anything he put in front of me. Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Eli cried from the small room then, sudden and sharp. Wade flinched. It was small, but Maggie saw it. She turned at once to go to the baby, but the dough stuck to her hands. Before she could wash them, Wade moved past her. He stopped in the doorway of the little room like a man, standing at the edge of a broken bridge. Eli cried again, waving his fists. Wade did not step closer. Maggie came beside him, wiping her hands on a towel. It is only hunger, she said gently. I know. But his voice said he knew something else too. He stared at Eli's small face, and in the child's cry he seemed to hear another cry from another winter, from a room upstairs where curtains had not opened in 7 years. Maggie lifted Eli and held him close. The baby settled little by little, his sobs becoming soft hiccups. Wade remained in the doorway. There was a cradle, he said. Maggie looked at him. For Anna. His eyes stayed on Eli. My father built it. It is still upstairs. The words were quiet, but they changed the air. Maggie understood what it took for him to say them. You do not have to bring it down, she said. Wade's jaw tightened. I know what I do not have to do. Then he turned and walked toward the stairs. Maggie followed with Eli in her arms, though she kept a respectful distance. Each step groaned beneath Wade's boots. At the top of the stairs, he stopped before a narrow door at the end of the hall. The brass key was already in his hand. For a long moment, he only stood there. Then he unlocked the room. Dust moved in the pale morning light. A small bed sat beneath the window. A faded quilt lay folded at the foot. On a shelf rested a cracked porcelain doll, a child's hair ribbon, and a tiny pair of shoes stiff with age. Beside the wall stood a pine cradle, smooth and simple, waiting like it had been holding its breath for years. Maggie said nothing. Wade stepped inside alone. His hand went to the cradle rail. His shoulders bent, not much but enough. The hard rancher from the porch was gone. In his place stood a man who had spent 7 winters keeping love locked away, because love had once left him with empty rooms. Eli reached one small hand toward the cradle. Wade saw it. His mouth trembled once before he mastered it. Then a sound rose from outside. Not the wind. Not a horse. A bell. The yard bell near the front gate. Someone was coming to Pine Hollow Ranch. And when Wade looked through the upstairs window, he saw a black buggy moving slowly through the snow, carrying a man in a city coat toward his door. The black buggy rolled through the snow like a dark thought refusing to stay buried. Wade Harlan stood at the upstairs window with one hand still resting on the old cradle rail. His face had gone still again, but it was no longer the same hard stillness Maggie had seen on the porch when she arrived. This was colder, sharper, a man preparing himself before opening the door to trouble. Maggie held Eli close and looked past Wade's shoulder. The buggy was fine, too fine for a ranch road after a storm. Black polished sides, narrow wheels packed with snow, a pair of matched bay horses pulling it carefully up the lane. The man driving wore a dark city coat and a round hat pulled low, but even from the upstairs room Maggie knew him. Her breath caught. Wade heard it. "That him?" he asked. Maggie did not pretend not to understand. "Yes." Wade's jaw tightened. Elias Crow. The name tasted bitter in the dusty room. Down in the yard, the buggy stopped near the hitching rail. Silas came out of the bunkhouse with Miguel close behind him. Henry appeared at the barn door holding a pitchfork like he had forgotten it was not a proper weapon. The men said nothing, but their bodies changed. Shoulders squared, boots planted, eyes narrowed against the snow. Crow climbed down slowly, brushing flakes from his sleeve with gloved fingers. He looked around Pine Hollow as if the place had already become his property, and he had come to inspect the damage. Maggie's hand trembled against Eli's blanket. Wade turned from the window. "Stay upstairs." "No." He stopped. Her voice had surprised even herself, but she did not take it back. "I have hidden long enough, Mr. Harlan. This is my ranch. And that man followed my child here." For a moment they looked at each other across the small room filled with old grief. A cracked doll watched from the shelf. The little shoes sat untouched in the dust. The cradle stood between past sorrow and present danger. Wade's eyes moved to Eli. Then he nodded once. "Then stay behind me until you choose to speak." They went downstairs together. By the time Wade opened the front door, Elias Crow was already on the porch, smiling like a guest arriving for Sunday supper. He was a lean man in his 40s, clean-shaven, with pale eyes and a neat black coat that did not belong in ranch mud. He removed his hat with careful politeness. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "forgive the intrusion." Wade did not invite him in. "What do you want?" Crow's smile held. "Straight to business. I admire that in a rancher." Wade stood in the doorway, broad enough to block most of the warm light behind him. "Then speak your business outside." Crow glanced past him. His eyes found Maggie. Something like satisfaction flickered across his face. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said softly, "there you are." Maggie felt Eli stir, and every bone in her body wanted to step back, but she stayed where she was. "Mr. Crow." Wade looked from one to the other. Crow sighed, as though pained by the whole matter. "I have ridden through miserable roads to settle an unfortunate misunderstanding. Mrs. Whitaker left Mercy Ridge in possession of county documents that do not belong to her. I am here to collect them and ensure she reaches town safely." "Safely?" Wade repeated. "Yes, a young mother alone can make poor choices when frightened." Maggie's face burned, but she kept her voice steady. "My husband made those copies. Your late husband was confused near the end, Crow said gently. Grief can make a widow remember things in strange shapes. Wade's eyes darkened. Careful. Crow looked at him with polite surprise. I mean no insult, only concern. She has a child to think of. You opened my gate last night, Wade said. Crow's smile thinned. I beg your pardon. One of my mares was nearly lost in the storm. Latch was lifted. That sounds like poor ranch keeping. Silas took one step forward from the yard. Wade lifted a hand without looking back, and the old foreman stopped. Crow's eyes moved over the men, the barn, the house, the snow-packed corrals. He was measuring things. Maggie saw it. He was always measuring. Land, fear, need, loneliness, weakness. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. I did not come to quarrel. Since I am here, I may as well address another matter. He held the paper toward Wade. There is an irregularity in your East Pasture claim. The county office requires a fresh acknowledgement of boundary lines before winter grazing continues. Wade did not take the paper. You mean you require it? I serve the county. You serve yourself. Crow's face tightened for the first time. Mr. Harlan, I advise you to be sensible. A legal dispute in winter could be costly. Cattle need water. Men need wages. A court order could make matters unpleasant. A quiet sound came from Maggie. Not a gasp. More like the small breath of a woman hearing the trap close exactly as she feared it would. Wade heard it too. He looked at Crow. You waited for snow. Crow smiled again. I waited for proper paperwork. Wade stepped onto the porch and pulled the door half-closed behind him, keeping Maggie and Eli in the warmth. Pine Hollow's East Pasture was my father's land. According to your memory, perhaps. According to his map. Crow's eyes sharpened. For 1 second his mask slipped. Then he looked past Wade toward Maggie, and his voice turned smooth again. Ah, so she has been spreading her husband's confusion here too. Maggie stepped forward before Wade could stop her. My husband died because he found stolen records. Crow's lips pressed together. Mrs. Whitaker, grief has made you reckless. No, she said, motherhood has made me brave. The porch went silent. Even the horses seemed to stop shifting. Crow studied her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a frightened widow, not as a woman with a baby he could push from one boarding house to another, but as someone who had crossed too many miles to be easily turned around. His voice lowered. You should think carefully about what kind of future you want for that boy. Wade moved so fast Maggie barely saw it. He did not strike Crow. He did not grab him. He simply stepped between them, close enough that Crow had to lean back. You do not speak of the child. Crow's smile vanished. Is this your answer, Mr. Harlan? My answer is get off my land. For now, Crow said, putting his hat back on, but land is only yours if the law agrees. He turned, walked down the porch steps, and climbed into his buggy. Silas and Miguel watched him pass. Henry gripped the pitchfork so tightly his knuckles turned white. Crow flicked the reins. The buggy began to roll away. Then, just before it reached the bend in the lane, Crow stopped and called back through the falling snow. Ask Mrs. Whitaker why her husband marked Pine Hollow first. Ask her what he found beneath your father's signature. The buggy disappeared into the white road. Wade stood frozen on the porch. Maggie felt the strength leave her knees. She had hoped to tell him before Crow twisted it. She had hoped for time, for trust, for one more quiet evening by the stove before the worst truth came out. Wade turned slowly. What did he mean? Maggie looked down at Eli. Her son's small hand rested over her heart, warm and unaware. Inside the house, the old cradle waited upstairs. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering every track except the ones that had already led trouble to Wade's door. Maggie lifted her eyes to Wade's. "Your father's signature was real," she whispered, "but Daniel believed he was forced to sign." Wade's face changed. Before he could speak, Silas shouted from the yard, "Boss Smoke!" They all turned. Beyond the barn, near the east pasture line, a dark column was rising into the pale winter sky. Wade ran down the steps. Maggie followed to the porch, Eli clutched tight in her arms. The hay shed by the winter pasture was burning. The hay shed burned like a warning written in fire. Wade Harlan ran across the yard with Silas and Miguel close behind him, boots sinking into the fresh snow. Henry shouted from the barn, and within seconds the quiet ranch exploded into motion. Men grabbed buckets, axes, wet blankets, anything their hands could find. Maggie stood on the porch with Eli pressed to her chest, unable to move for one terrible breath. The smoke rose black against the white morning. Flames chewed along the side of the shed, licking at the stacked hay inside. The winter pasture lay beyond it, and past that the creek bend Wade had just learned someone was trying to steal from him. This was no accident. She knew it. Wade knew it too. But knowing did not stop fire. "Water line," Silas shouted. The men formed a chain from the trough to the shed. Buckets passed hand to hand, sloshing over sleeves and gloves. Steam hissed when the water struck the flames. The horses in the nearby corral tossed their heads and pulled at the fence, frightened by the smoke. Wade reached the shed first. He yanked open the side gate, coughing as gray smoke rolled over him. Miguel grabbed his arm, but Wade shook him off and plunged inside. Maggie's heart lurched. "No," she whispered. Eli stirred against her, his small hand curling in her shawl. The old fear rose in her so suddenly that for a moment she was not in Wyoming anymore. She was back in a narrow rented room, holding a letter Daniel would never read, hearing men outside talk in low voices about accidents and records and how widows ought to keep quiet. Then she saw Henry stumble near the well, dropping a bucket as panic overtook him. The men were fighting the fire, but they were losing time. Maggie turned and hurried back into the kitchen. She placed Eli in the wooden crate near the stove, wrapped him tight, and knelt before him. "Stay warm, my little brave boy." He looked up at her with wide eyes. She kissed his forehead, then ran back outside. Cold hit her face like a slap. She lifted her skirt enough to move fast and cross the yard. Snow soaked the hem of her dress. Smoke burned her throat. "Maggie, stay back," Silas shouted. But she ignored him. At the side of the shed, several loose hay bales had caught sparks and were beginning to burn. If the flames reached the main stack, there would be nothing left for the cattle by nightfall. She grabbed a wet blanket from the snow and threw it over the nearest bale, beating down the sparks with both hands. Heat stung her face. Smoke filled her eyes. She coughed, stumbled, and kept working. A ranch hand tried to pull her away. "Ma'am, it ain't safe." "Then move faster," she snapped. The man stared at her, then obeyed. Together they dragged the smoldering bales into the snow. Miguel used an axe to break loose a charred support beam before it fell inward. Silas shouted orders until his voice turned rough. Then Wade emerged from the smoke carrying a burning sack of feed against his coat. He hurled it into the snow and stamped out the flames. His face was blackened, his eyes red, and one sleeve of his coat smoked at the cuff. Maggie rushed to him. "You're armed." "I am fine." "You are burning." He looked down as if only then noticing the ember eating through the wool. Maggie seized a handful of snow and pressed it hard against his sleeve. Steam rose between them. Wade stared at her. For one strange second, fire roared behind them, men shouted, horses cried, and yet all Maggie could see was his face. Not the cold rancher from the porch. Not the angry man who had accused her of bringing trouble. A man who had run into flames to save hay for animals that depended on him. A man who had stood between her son and Elia's crow without asking what it would cost him. His voice came low. "You should not be out here. Neither should you." A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but close enough to hurt. Then the shed roof groaned. Wade grabbed her by the waist and pulled her back just as a burned board cracked loose and fell where she had been standing. Sparks burst upward. Maggie gasped. His arm stayed around her for one heartbeat too long. Then he released her. "Get to the house," he said, but this time the command carried fear, not anger. The men fought for another hour. At last the flames died under water, snow, and torn wet blankets. The shed was damaged but not lost. Half the hay was ruined. The rest could be saved if they moved it quickly. Wade stood before the blackened wall, breathing hard. Silas bent and picked something from the trampled snow near the shed door. "What is it?" Wade asked. The old foreman held it out. A strip of dark cloth. Not from a feed sack, not from any ranch coat Wade knew. Wade took it between two fingers. Maggie stepped closer. There was a faint smell on it, sharp and oily. "Lamp oil," she said. Silas's face hardened. Fire was set. No one spoke for a moment. The truth did not need help. Wade looked toward the lane where Crow's buggy had gone. Henry spat into the snow. "We ought to ride after him." "No," Wade said. "But boss." "No." The word cut clean through the cold air. Wade turned to his men. His burned sleeve hung torn at the wrist. Soot streaked his cheek. "We fight this with proof, not anger. Crow wants me reckless. He wants me to look like a man who cannot govern his own land or temper." Maggie looked at him with quiet surprise. It was the first time she had heard him speak of justice without bitterness. Silas nodded slowly. "Then we gather what we got. We move the good hay first," Wade said. "Then we check every gate, every fence, every track before fresh snow hides them." The men scattered to work. Maggie started toward the house, but Wade stopped her. "Maggie." It was the first time he had said her name without hesitation. She turned. His gaze dropped to her hands. They were red from cold and smoke, her palms scraped from dragging wet bales. "You helped save my stock. You gave me shelter. That was one night." She held his gaze. Kindness does not become smaller because it was brief. Something shifted in his face. He looked as if her words had found a place he did not know was still tender. From inside the house, Eli began to cry. Maggie turned at once, but Wade reached the porch before her and opened the door. He did not step away after she entered. He followed her into the kitchen, quiet and unsure. Eli was red-faced and frightened in the crate, his tiny fists waving. Maggie lifted him and held him close. "Hush now, Mama is here." The baby kept crying. Wade stood by the table, looking helpless in a way she had never seen. Slowly, as if approaching a skittish colt, he removed one glove and reached toward Eli. Maggie stilled. Wade's fingers brushed the baby's blanket. Eli's cry weakened. Wade swallowed. "My sister liked songs," he said. Maggie looked at him. He did not meet her eyes. Instead, in a voice low and rough from smoke, he began humming a tune that sounded old, broken, and half-remembered. Eli quieted. Maggie's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back. Wade stopped as soon as he realized the baby had settled. Outside, men called to one another in the snow. Inside, the kitchen held a fragile peace. Then Silas burst through the door. carrying Wade's father's old map in one hand and Daniel's copied paper in the other. "Boss," he said, breathless, "you need to see this." Wade took the papers. Silas pointed to the creek bend on both maps. "These lines do not just cut off pasture." Wade's face hardened as he understood. Maggie held Eli tighter. Silas lowered his voice. "They cut off the family graveyard." The word struck Wade Harlan harder than the fire had. The family graveyard. For a moment he did not move. The old map trembled once in his soot-darkened hand, and the kitchen seemed to fall away around him. The smell of smoke, wet wool, and burned hay remained, but Wade was no longer standing beside the stove with Maggie and Eli. He was 8 years old again, following his father across the east pasture on a spring morning. The grass had been high then, green as bottled glass, bending under a soft wind. His mother had carried a basket of wildflowers. His little sister Anna had run ahead in a yellow dress, laughing whenever her shoes sank into the damp earth near the creek bend. His father had stopped beneath 3 cottonwood trees and taken off his hat. "This is ours, Wade," he had said, "not just for grazing, for remembering." That was where they had buried his grandparents. Later his mother. Then Anna. Then his father. Wade looked down at the county copy again. The false line cut clean across that sacred corner, placing the cottonwoods outside Pine Hollow's claim. Crow had not only tried to steal water. He had tried to steal the place where Wade's dead slept. Maggie saw the change in him and stepped closer. Eli nestled against her shoulder. "Wade," she said softly. He did not answer. His eyes had gone distant and dangerous. Silas must have seen it too, because the old foreman moved between Wade and the door. "Boss," he said carefully, "do not ride to Mercy Ridge like this." Wade folded the paper with slow, stiff hands. "Move." "No." The whole kitchen froze. Henry, standing near the back door, stared at Silas as if the old man had just stepped in front of a stampede. Miguel lowered his eyes, but he did not move away. Maggie held her breath. Wade looked at Silas. "You forget whose ranch this is." "No," Silas said. "I remember better than most. I also remember your father would rather lose a fence than see his son hang himself on another man's trap." Wade's face tightened. "I am not a fool." "You are wounded." Silas's voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of years. "And wounded men make Crow's work easy." Wade's gaze dropped to the torn sleeve on his coat, then to the papers in his hand. For one terrible second, Maggie thought he might push past them all and ride into the snow with grief driving the reins. Then Eli made a small sound. Not a cry. A soft, sleepy hum against Maggie's shoulder. Wade looked at the baby. The hard line of his mouth broke slightly, as if that tiny sound had reached through the anger and touched the living part of him. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the danger was not gone, but it had been bridled. "No one rides to town today," Wade said. Silas nodded once. "Good." "We gather proof," Wade continued. "Tracks near the shed, cloth, oil gate latch, my father's map, Daniel Whitaker's copies, anything else we can find." Maggie swallowed. "There is more." Every face turned toward her. She wished she could have chosen a gentler hour, a warmer room, a time when Wade's heart was not already bleeding from fresh knowledge. But truth had come to Pine Hollow like winter, and there was no stopping it at the door. She laid Eli carefully in the crate near the stove and pulled her carpet bag onto the table. From the bottom, beneath folded baby clothes and a worn hymnal, she removed a narrow packet wrapped in brown cloth. Wade watched without speaking. Maggie untied the string. Inside were Daniel's notes. Pages filled with careful handwriting. Names, dates, claim numbers, clerk marks, copies of signatures, and small sketches of land boundaries. Some pages were stained where rain or tears had touched the ink. Others were worn soft from being unfolded too many times. "My husband made 3 packets," she said. "One for the territorial judge, one for a newspaper editor in Cheyenne, one for me in case he could not deliver the others." Her voice thinned. "He never got the chance." Wade picked up one page. His fingers paused over Daniel's handwriting. "Why did you not send these from St. Louis?" "Because Crow had friends beyond Mercy Ridge. A letter can vanish. A widow can be called confused. A baby can be used as a reason to take pity in public and power in private." Her hand drifted toward Eli. "So I brought them myself." Henry, who had been silent too long, whispered, "All that way." Maggie looked at him. "All that way?" No one laughed. No one questioned her. Even the fire seemed to burn softer. Wade looked from one page to another. Daniel found 6 altered claims. 7, Maggie said. Wade's eyes lifted. The 7th was not finished when he died, Pine Hollow. Silas swore under his breath, then remembered Eli and pressed his lips shut. Maggie almost smiled, despite the heaviness in the room. Daniel believed Crow could not take Pine Hollow all at once. Your ranch is too known, too old. But if he could cut off water and the graveyard, he could pressure you later, make you sign new terms, make it look legal. Wade stared at the papers. "And if I refused?" Maggie's eyes went to the window, where the black smoke had faded into gray sky. "Then accidents happen." The truth sat among them like a cold guest. For the rest of the day, Pine Hollow moved with quiet purpose. The men worked without their usual jokes. Silas and Miguel searched the burned shed and found 2 clear sets of tracks near the far side, one from Crow's buggy, one from a rider who had stayed beyond the fence line. Henry found a bent nail wedged under the gate latch, placed so the latch would lift with a pull from outside. Wade wrapped the oil-smelling cloth in paper and stored it with the documents. Maggie returned to the kitchen, but work no longer felt like hiding. It felt like helping hold the walls up. She baked bread while the men moved salvaged hay. She boiled coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She tore strips from an old flour sack and wrapped Wade's burned wrist when he finally allowed her to look at it. He sat at the table silent while she cleaned the reddened skin. "It is not deep," she said. "Good. You should have told me it hurt. I have had worse. That does not make this nothing." He looked at her then. There was no anger in his eyes now, only exhaustion, and something else he did not yet know how to name. "You speak to me like you have a right." Maggie's hand stilled. Then she lowered her eyes to the bandage. "Forgive me." "I did not say stop." Her fingers resumed their careful work. Outside, the wind softened. Snow slid from the roof in a dull rush. In the crate by the stove, Eli kicked his blanket loose, and Wade reached down without thinking to tuck it back around him. Maggie saw it. So did Wade. His hand froze, then slowly finished the small task. Eli caught one of Wade's fingers. The kitchen went very quiet. Wade stared at that tiny grip. "My sister used to hold my thumb when she was afraid," he said. Maggie did not speak. She thought if she held on, nothing bad could reach her. His voice roughened. She was wrong. Maggie tied the bandage and sat across from him. "Maybe she was not wrong about the holding on," she said. "Maybe only the world was cruel that day." Wade looked away, but not before she saw the grief rise. That evening, when the men had eaten and Eli slept, a rider came from the North Trail. He was half frozen, bent low over his horse, his coat white with snow. Miguel spotted him first and called for Wade. Everyone gathered at the porch as the rider slipped from the saddle, nearly falling into Silas's arms. He was young, no more than 19, with a split lip and fear bright in his eyes. "Pine Hollow," he gasped. Wade stepped forward. "You found it." The boy pulled a folded envelope from inside his coat and pushed it into Wade's hand. "From Mercy Ridge," he said. "A woman at the telegraph office told me to bring it straight, said not to trust the county clerk." Maggie's heart hammered. Wade opened the envelope. Inside was a short note, written in a hurried hand. He read it once, then again. His face hardened. Maggie moved beside him. "What does it say?" Wade handed her the note. Maggie read the words by lantern light, and the blood seemed to leave her hands. "Mrs. Whitaker is not safe at Pine Hollow. Crow has filed papers claiming the child is abandoned property of the county if she is found without lawful employment or family protection. He means to take the baby before he takes the land." Maggie could not breathe. Behind her, Eli slept peacefully in the warm kitchen, unaware that a man in town had turned his small life into another piece of paper. Wade looked toward the dark road. Then he turned back to Maggie, and his voice was quiet, steady, and changed. "Then before Crow comes again," he said, "we make sure you and that child are not standing alone." The note from Mercy Ridge changed the house before anyone moved. For a long moment, Maggie Whitaker stood on the porch with the paper in her hand, feeling the cold pass through her dress as if the winter itself had stepped inside her bones. Crow meant to take Eli. Not because Eli had done anything. Not because Maggie had failed him. But because a powerful man had found another way to punish a mother for carrying the truth. Behind her, Eli slept in the kitchen near the stove, one small hand resting outside his blanket. He did not know county words. He did not know claims, clerks, stamps, or laws written by men who had never held him through fever or hunger. He only knew warmth, milk, and the sound of his mother's voice. Maggie folded the note with trembling fingers. "I should leave," she whispered. Wade Harlan turned sharply. "No. If I stay, Crow comes here with papers and men. He will say I lied to you. He will say I brought trouble to your ranch. He will use Eli to force your hand." "He already tried." "Then I should not give him more reason." Wade stepped closer, his face hard in the lantern glow. "You think walking into the snow with a baby gives him less reason?" Maggie looked away. Silas stood near the steps, jaw tight beneath his gray beard. Miguel held the exhausted rider's horse by the reins. Henry hovered in the doorway, young face pale with worry. The whole ranch seemed to be listening. Maggie's voice broke, despite her effort to keep it steady. "I have run from rented rooms, from train depots, from men who looked at my son like he was a burden to be handled. I came here because Daniel's last notes pointed to Pine Hollow. I thought if I reached this place, I could protect the papers long enough for someone honest to read them." She pressed one hand to her chest. "But now Crow is using Eli. He is just a baby, Wade." Wade's expression shifted at the sound of his name. She had said it before, but never like this. Never with her fear laid bare between them. He looked past her into the kitchen. Eli stirred but did not wake. "When I was 16, Wade said quietly, "I watched men carry 3 coffins through that yard in one winter." No one spoke. His eyes stayed on the warm square of light from the kitchen window. "After that, I decided a man could survive anything if he did not love what could be taken from him." Maggie's throat tightened. Wade turned back to her. "I was wrong." The words were simple, but they struck harder than a confession shouted in anger. Silas lowered his eyes. Wade took the note from Maggie's hand and folded it once more. "Crow is counting on you standing alone. He is counting on me being too afraid of loss to claim what is right in front of me." Maggie stared at him. "What are you saying?" Wade looked at Eli again, then at her. "I am saying you have employment at Pine Hollow, lawful, paid, witnessed by every man here." Crow's words echoed in Maggie's mind. "Without lawful employment or family protection." Her fingers went cold. "And family protection?" she asked. Wade did not answer at once. The wind moved across the porch, lifting the edge of his coat. Snow slipped from the roof in a soft rush and broke apart near the steps. At last he said, "I will not let him take the child." "That is not the same." "No," Wade said, "it is not." His voice had changed again. It was steady, but there was a roughness in it, like a man walking toward a place he feared and wanted at the same time. "Maggie, I cannot offer you fancy words. I have forgotten most of them. I cannot promise an easy life. This ranch wakes before daylight and sleeps after the stars are high. Winter here can turn cruel. Men like Crow do not give up just because decent people ask them to." She watched him, unable to breathe. "But if protection is what the law demands," he continued, "then I can give it a name it understands." Silas lifted his head. Henry's mouth fell slightly open. Maggie shook her head once, afraid to understand. "Do not say it from pity." Wade's eyes held hers. "I would not shame you that way. Do not say it because you feel trapped." "I have lived trapped for 7 years, Maggie. Since you stepped off that wagon, this is the first house I have wanted to come back into." Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Wade took one careful step closer. "I sent for a cook because I thought I needed hands to keep men fed. But what came to my door was a woman braver than any man I know, carrying a child who laughs in rooms I thought would stay dead forever." Maggie pressed her lips together, fighting tears. "I have not told you everything." "Then tell me." The porch went still. This was the moment she had feared since the day she boarded the train with Eli hidden under her shawl. The last truth. The one Daniel had left folded inside his Bible. The one Crow had guessed but never found. Maggie looked toward the men. Wade understood. "Inside," he said. They gathered in the kitchen, where the stove gave off steady heat and the firelight made the windows black. Eli woke as Maggie lifted him, but he only blinked and settled against her. The rider from Mercy Ridge sat near the door with a cup of coffee in both hands, still shaking from cold. Maggie opened her carpet bag one final time. From the lining, hidden beneath careful stitches, she pulled a small oilskin envelope. Wade's brows drew together. "You sewed it into the bag." "Daniel did." She placed it on the table. "My husband knew he might not survive after what he found. He told me if anything happened, I was not to trust the courthouse copy alone. He said the real proof was not in the records." Wade looked at the envelope. "Where was it?" Maggie swallowed. "In your father's own hand." She opened the oilskin and removed a thin packet of pages. The first was a letter, faded but clear, signed by Wade's father, Abram Harlan. Wade's face changed when he saw the signature. Maggie spoke softly. "Daniel found it hidden inside an old survey book. Your father wrote to a judge months before he died. He said Elias Crow and 2 others had tried to force him into signing a false boundary agreement. He refused. Then your family took sick that winter, and after the burials, Crow filed altered papers claiming Abram Harlan had agreed before his death." Wade reached for the letter with unsteady hands. His eyes moved over the words. Maggie saw his grief deepen, but this time it did not close him off. It opened him. "My father fought him," Wade whispered. "Yes." "He did not give it away." "No." Wade bowed his head. For 7 years, some part of him had carried a secret shame he had never spoken, a fear that his father had made a poor choice, signed under debt, weakness, or despair. Now that weight lifted, but the lifting hurt nearly as much as the burden. Maggie continued. Daniel believed Crow wanted the graveyard because your father may have hidden the original boundary marker there, beneath the center cottonwood. Silas stepped forward. The old iron marker. Wade looked up. You knew. Your pa showed it to me once, Silas said. Said if paper ever lied, iron in the ground would tell the truth. Wade stood so quickly the chair scraped backward. We ride to the cottonwoods. Tonight, Henry asked. Before Crow does. Maggie held Eli tighter. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the night was deep and cold. Wade looked at her. You stay here. This time Maggie did not argue, not because she was afraid, but because she saw the purpose in his eyes and knew this was something a son had to do for his father. Before he left, Wade paused beside Eli. The baby reached one hand toward him. Wade touched the tiny fingers gently. If you believe one act of courage can change a whole life, stay with this story, because the truth buried under those cottonwood trees may decide the fate of everyone at Pine Hollow. Then Wade stepped into the winter night with Silas, Miguel, and Henry behind him. Maggie stood at the window, watching their lanterns move across the white pasture toward the dark line of cottonwoods near the creek. For several minutes, there was only silence. Then from the far pasture, a gunshot cracked into the cold sky. Maggie's heart stopped. Eli began to cry. And beyond the window, one of the lanterns fell into the snow. The gunshot broke the night open. Maggie Whitaker stood frozen at the kitchen window, one hand pressed to the cold glass, Eli crying against her shoulder. Out beyond the snowfield, the lantern that had fallen burned weakly in the white dark, its light half buried and shaking. For one terrible moment, she could not tell who had fallen with it. Then a voice carried faintly from the pasture. Wade. It was Silas. Maggie's breath caught hard in her chest. She set Eli in the crate by the stove, wrapped him tight with trembling hands, and ran to the back door. The cold struck her face as soon as she opened it. Snow glittered under the moon. The cottonwood trees stood black near the creek bend, their bare limbs twisting against the stars like old fingers pointing at heaven. She wanted to run. Every part of her wanted to cross that field. But Eli cried behind her, and the sound pulled her back like a rope around the heart. She turned, torn in two. Please, she whispered into the cold, please let him be alive. Another shout came from the pasture, then movement, 2 lanterns lifted, one figure bent over another near the trees. Maggie gripped the doorframe until the wood bit into her palm. At last, after what felt like a lifetime, 3 shapes started back across the field. Miguel and Henry were supporting someone between them. Wade. His hat was gone. One side of his coat hung torn. He was walking, but not alone. Silas followed behind, carrying something long and dark over his shoulder. Maggie ran into the yard then, unable to wait. Wade. He lifted his head at her voice. I am standing, he called back, though the words came rough. That was all she needed to hear before her knees nearly gave. The men reached the porch, breath smoking in the night air. Wade's left arm was pressed against his ribs, and a dark tear showed across his sleeve, but there was no terrible wound, no blood soaking the snow. A bullet had grazed through his coat and burned the skin beneath, more warning than killing shot. Maggie looked him over with frantic eyes. You were shot. Grazed. That is still shot. Silas snorted despite the danger, told him the same thing. Wade's gaze softened for one breath. I am all right. You do not get to decide that before I look." The words came out sharp with fear. Wade did not argue. Inside, Maggie cleaned the wound with warm water while Wade sat at the kitchen table, jaw tight but silent. Eli had quieted again, watching from his crate with solemn eyes. Henry stood near the stove, pale and shaken. Miguel leaned by the door, one hand resting on his hat. Silas laid the long dark object on the table. It was an iron boundary marker, black with age, mud still frozen to its base. Maggie stared. "You found it." Wade nodded. "Under the center cottonwood, right where your husband said." Silas unfolded a torn scrap of cloth beside it. "And we found the man Crow sent digging." Maggie's heart jumped. "Where is he?" "Ran when he fired," Henry said. "His horse was tied beyond the creek. He dropped his shovel and nearly broke his neck getting away." Wade's eyes hardened. "He fired high, meant to scare us off or make us fire back." "Crow still wants you reckless," Maggie said. "He will be disappointed." Wade's voice was calm, but Maggie saw the fight inside him. His hand rested near his ribs, fingers flexing once in pain, not only from the bullet graze, from the graveyard, from his father's letter, from knowing that men had been stealing from his family while grief kept him locked inside his own silence. Maggie finished, wrapping the bandage around his arm. "This proof is enough?" she asked. Silas looked at the table. "We have the old map, Daniel's notes, Abram Harlan's letter, the marker, tracks, cloth from the fire, the telegraph warning. Might be enough for a judge if we get it to the right one." "Not Mercy Ridge," Maggie said quickly. "No," Wade said, "Cheyenne." At the sound of the city, Maggie's stomach tightened. Cheyenne meant travel, exposure, Crow's reach, more roads, more strangers, more chances for Eli to be used against her. Wade saw the fear in her face. "I will go," he said. "No." Everyone looked at her. Maggie lifted her chin. "No, Wade. This began with Daniel. It continued with your father. But I carried those papers here, and Crow will not stop calling me confused unless I stand before someone honest and speak." Wade leaned forward. "He threatened your child. That is why I have to speak." Her voice shook, but it did not break. "If I run again, Eli grows up with a mother who hid from every cruel man with a clean coat and a courthouse stamp. I do not want that life for him. I do not want him learning fear before he learns his own name." Wade's face changed. Slowly, he looked toward the crate. Eli kicked beneath his blanket and made a small sleepy sound. Maggie sat across from Wade. "I am afraid," she said. "I have been afraid since the day Daniel died. But I am more afraid of letting Crow decide what kind of woman my son will remember." The kitchen was silent. Then Silas cleared his throat. "Cheyenne Road will be hard after the storm, but the South Pass should open by morning if the wind holds." Miguel nodded. 2 wagons, one for people, one for papers and supplies, men with them. Henry straightened. "I will ride." Wade looked around the room. Pine Hollow had once been a house full of hired hands and silence. Now every man in that kitchen stood ready to defend a woman and child who had arrived only days before. Something moved across Wade's face that Maggie could not name. Gratitude, maybe. Or wonder. He turned back to her. "We go together." Maggie blinked. "You do not have to." "Yes," he said, "I do." The words were quiet but final. Later, after the men left to prepare the wagons, Maggie remained in the kitchen with Wade. The house was nearly still. Eli slept at last. The iron marker lay wrapped in burlap on the table, beside the papers that had brought so much danger. Wade stood near the stove, looking at the small room off the kitchen. "You plan to leave tonight," he said. Maggie's heart sank. She had hoped he had not guessed. She looked down. Yes. Why? To spare you. His eyes lifted to hers. You thought leaving would spare me. If Crow came and found me gone, maybe he would have no reason to burn more sheds or threaten your land. Maggie. The sound of her name stopped her. Wade stepped closer, slow enough that she could turn away if she wished. I spent 7 years sparing myself from love. It did not spare me pain. It only made the house colder. Her eyes filled. I do not want to be another loss in your life. You do not get to decide that by disappearing. The words were firm but not cruel. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. The wooden horse from Anna's room. Maggie stared at it. Wade held it carefully, as if it were alive. I kept this because I could not let go, but I locked it away because I could not bear to remember. He looked toward Eli. Maybe a thing can belong to the past and still bless the living. He placed the carved horse on the edge of Eli's crate. Maggie pressed a hand to her mouth. Wade. My sister would have liked him, he said. His voice broke on the last word. Maggie reached for his hand. This time he did not pull away. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm and still shaking from the cold outside. For a long moment neither spoke. The wind moved softly around the house, no longer screaming, only sighing beneath the eaves. By dawn, the wagons were ready. Silas loaded the iron marker beneath sacks of feed. Miguel packed blankets and coffee. Henry checked the rifles, then carefully wrapped them and set them under the wagon bench, not for threat, but for the long road through empty country. Maggie dressed Eli in every warm thing he owned and tucked Daniel's final papers inside her coat. Wade came from the barn leading his strongest team. He looked tired, pale beneath the soot still caught in the lines of his face, but his eyes were clear. Before they climbed into the wagon, Maggie looked back at Pine Hollow Ranch. The house stood quiet under the morning light. Smoke lifted from the chimney. The upstairs curtain in Anna's room was open now, and sunlight touched the window for the first time in 7 winters. Maggie noticed. So did Wade. Neither said a word. They rode out toward Cheyenne with proof hidden beneath flour sacks, grief riding behind them, and hope sitting between them like a fragile flame. But from the ridge above Pine Hollow, a lone rider watched the wagons leave. When they disappeared into the south road, he turned his horse toward Mercy Ridge. And by noon, Elias Crow knew exactly where they were going. Cheyenne lay 2 hard days beyond Pine Hollow, but trouble reached the road before the city did. By late afternoon, the wagons had crossed the South Pass and moved into a wide stretch of open country where the snow lay thin over brown grass. The sky had cleared, cold and pale, and the team horses breathed white clouds into the air. Maggie Whitaker sat beside Wade Harlan on the front bench, Eli wrapped between them in a nest of quilts. Behind them rode Silas, Miguel, and Henry, watchful and quiet. No one spoke much. The proof beneath the flour sacks seemed to weigh more than iron. Daniel's papers, Abram Harlan's letter, the old map, the boundary marker. Every mile carried them closer to justice, but every mile also carried them farther from the safety of Pine Hollow. Near dusk, they reached a narrow crossing where the road dipped between 2 rocky slopes. Wade slowed the team. Silas rode up beside him. Bad place to stop, the old foreman muttered. I know. Maggie looked ahead. A wagon blocked the crossing. One wheel sat crooked in the ruts, and a man in a county coat stood beside it, hands folded neatly over his cane. Elias Crow. Maggie's arms tightened around Eli. Wade's face went still. Crow lifted one gloved hand, like a man greeting neighbors after church. Mr. Harlan, he called. Mrs. Whitaker, I am relieved to have found you before this foolish journey went any farther. Silas moved his horse forward, but Wade raised a hand. Crow's smile did not reach his eyes. I have county authority to escort Mrs. Whitaker and the child back to Mercy Ridge for proper review. Maggie's fear rose, but this time it did not rule her. She passed Eli carefully to Wade. He looked down at the baby in surprise. "Hold him," she whispered. Then she stood in the wagon. Crow's smile weakened. "I am not going back with you," Maggie said. "My dear woman, you are tired and frightened." "No, I am awake." The words rang across the cold road. Crow's eyes hardened. "You have no lawful family here." Wade stood then, Eli held against his chest, the blue blanket tucked beneath his chin. "She does." Crow gave a soft laugh. "A rancher's kindness is not kinship." "No," Wade said, "but a public promise can be." He looked at Silas. The old foreman reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, signed that morning by every man at Pine Hollow and witnessed by the telegraph writer. It stated that Maggie Whitaker was employed at Pine Hollow Ranch under Wade Harlan's protection, with wages, shelter, and safe standing until the court heard her case. Crow glanced at it and sneered. "A kitchen agreement does not beat county authority." "Maybe not," Wade said, "but this might." He nodded to Miguel. Miguel pulled back the flour sacks and lifted out Abraham Harlan's iron boundary marker. Henry held up the old map. Silas raised Daniel's packet of notes. For the first time, Crow's face lost its polish. "You stole county records," he snapped. Maggie stepped down from the wagon. "My husband copied stolen records," she said. "There is a difference." Crow turned on her. "Your husband was a clerk with more ambition than sense." "He was honest," Maggie said, "and because he was honest you feared him." A rider appeared on the far side of the crossing. Then another. For one breath, Maggie thought Crow had brought more men. But the first rider lifted a hand, and Silas broke into a grin. It was Mrs. Bell from the Mercy Ridge telegraph office. Beside her rode a federal marshal from Cheyenne, his badge catching the low sun. Behind them came the young rider who had brought the warning note. Crow stepped back. The marshal dismounted. "Elias Crow." Crow straightened. "I am Clerk Crow of Mercy Ridge County." "Then you can explain these complaints in Cheyenne." The marshal looked at Wade. Mrs. Bell wired ahead, said a widow and a rancher were bringing proof of land fraud, intimidation, and false custody filings. Crow's cane struck the frozen dirt. "This is a local matter." "Not anymore." Maggie felt her knees weaken, but Wade was beside her now. Eli rested against his shoulder, calm and warm, one tiny hand gripping Wade's coat. The marshal took the papers, checked the names, then looked at Crow. "You will come peacefully." Crow's mouth opened, but no smooth words came. For years he had trusted stamps, seals, and fear. On that cold road, truth finally stood taller. There was no gunfight, no shouting revenge, only the quiet sound of a corrupt man's power leaving him piece by piece as the marshal took his cane, his papers, and his clean black coat of authority. By the time the sun disappeared, Elias Crow was riding toward Cheyenne under guard. Maggie stood beside the wagon, shaking so hard she could hardly breathe. "It is over?" she asked. Wade looked toward the road. "Not all at once. Court will take time. Land records must be restored. Folks Crow harmed will need to speak." Then he turned to her. "But he will not take Eli." The tears came then. Not loud, not helpless. Just the kind of tears that rise when a woman has carried fear so long that safety feels almost impossible to believe. Wade handed Eli back to her, then gently placed his rough hand over both of theirs. and he will not take Pine Hollow. Weeks passed before the final ruling came. The territorial judge in Cheyenne confirmed the altered records. Abram Harlan's original boundary was restored. The creek bend and the cottonwood graveyard remained part of Pine Hollow. 6 other families recovered land Crow had stolen through fear and false papers. Daniel Whitaker's name was entered into the record as the man whose notes had uncovered the fraud. When Maggie heard that, she pressed Eli's small hand to Daniel's old Bible and whispered, "Your father did right." Winter settled deep over Wyoming, but Pine Hollow no longer felt like a house waiting for loss. The upstairs curtain stayed open. Anna's cradle was brought down, cleaned, and placed near the kitchen stove, where Eli slept while Maggie cooked. Wade fixed the burned hay shed with his own hands, and every new board felt like a promise. Silas carved Eli a little wooden cow. Miguel sang to him in the evenings. Henry, still awkward, learned to hold the baby without looking terrified. And Wade changed in small ways that meant everything. He laughed once when Eli threw mashed potatoes onto his sleeve. He kept extra kindling by the kitchen door. He stopped turning the photograph face down on the shelf. One night after supper, Maggie found Wade standing by the hearth, holding Anna's wooden horse. Eli was asleep in the cradle, his cheeks pink from warmth. "I used to think love was a door a man should lock before winter got in," Wade said. Maggie stood beside him. "And now?" He looked at Eli, then at her. "Now I think a locked door keeps out more than cold." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass ring. Not fancy, not new, his mother's ring, cleaned until it caught the firelight. "I cannot promise life will never hurt," he said, "but I can promise you will never have to face it alone at Pine Hollow." Maggie's eyes filled again, but this time her smile came with them. "Yes," she whispered, "if you will take both of us." Wade looked toward the cradle. "I already did." Spring came months later, soft and green along the creek bend. Beneath the 3 cottonwoods, Wade placed fresh flowers on his family's graves. Maggie stood beside him with Eli on her hip. The baby reached for the leaves moving overhead, laughing at the sunlight as if the whole world had been made new for him. Wade took Maggie's hand. Behind them, Pine Hollow Ranch stood warm in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney, horses grazing near the fence, and the kitchen window shining bright in the morning. He had sent for a cook. What arrived was a woman with dust on her boots, courage in her heart, and a baby who brought laughter back into rooms grief had emptied. Some homes are not found at the end of an easy road. Some are built by people brave enough to stay when the storm comes. And at Pine Hollow, where silence once ruled every room, love finally had the last word. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories where kindness, truth, and love still find their way home.